Hello, welcome. Welcome to our Holmer Lecture. We're very glad that you're here with us tonight. I'm Casey Shalapsky. I'm the program manager at Anselm House. And so for those of you who are new to Anselm House, we've been around since 1982, and so we're celebrating our 40th year this year. We've had a lot of fun activities to celebrate. 40 years of serving the University of Minnesota campus. And so simply put, why does Anselm House exist? We exist to help students and faculty at the University of Minnesota connect faith and knowledge with all of life. So we recognize that sometimes faith and knowledge are seen as rival accounts of the world, but we'd like to humbly submit that faith and knowledge are deeply compatible when properly aligned. And so when we have this alliance, it provides all sorts of resources for us to pursue the good life, to pursue the true, the good, and the beautiful that is in our world. So we would love to share opportunities with you about how to be involved in Anselm House, whether you're a student, faculty, or staff at the U, or whether you're part of our greater Twin Cities community. And so one easy way that you can get info on how to be involved is that you can scan this QR code with your phone right now if you would like to sign up to be on our email list. If you do that tonight, we are doing a giveaway for a couple of signed copies of Meghan Sullivan's book, The Good Life Method, that we'll give away at the end of the evening. Now, some of you in the audience are saying, well, I already get your emails, but I really want to be a part of the giveaway opportunity, so you can be included. Just sign up again. So it's easy. So scan the QR code. It'll take you to a form. It takes less than a minute to fill out, and you'll be in for the drawing, and you'll be receiving emails from us about how upcoming events and ways to be involved. So we're very glad that you're here tonight, whether you've been coming to these events for a long time or this is your very first Anselm House event. We hope you feel very welcome. And lastly, I just want to mention that tonight marks our 27th Holmer Lecture, 27th. So it's named in honor of the late Paul L. Holmer, who was a professor here at the U. He was a philosopher, he was a Kierkegaard scholar. He later went to Yale Divinity School. But we think by naming this annual lecture after him, we remember that the Anselm House community continues in a much larger and longer tradition of faithful Christian presence at the University of Minnesota. So it's an honor for us to remember those who have gone before us at the university and who have embodied the mission to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. So I'm going to ask my colleague, AJ, to come up, and he's going to give you a little introduction to our guest speaker, Meghan Sullivan. So thank you.
Well, our speaker for tonight is Dr. Meghan Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan is professor of philosophy and the Reverend John O'Brien Collegiate Chair at the University of Notre Dame. So she came to us from Indiana. She's the author of 2 books. The first one on the philosophy of time, which is pretty cool, titled Time Biases, in which she develops a theory of diachronic rationality, personal identity, and reason-based planning. So if you're interested in that, get that book somewhere. A second book, and that's the one that we're going to give away tonight, is a popular level reworking of her course, God and a Good Life. And so this book is called The Good Life Method. But the course that she teaches at Notre Dame, that she co-teaches with several other people, is the most popular course at the university there. And she told us this afternoon that over 5,000 students have taken it, right? Something like that. You don't know. You don't keep track of the numbers. Anyway, it's all like, whoa, can you imagine the grading? In this course, they try to help students ask the big philosophical questions concerning happiness, morality, and meaning, and try to give them key methods to wrestle with those questions. And so if you get the book tonight, you can read it. If you don't get it, if you're not one of the prize winners, just go and buy the book, because it's actually a fascinating book. In addition, she also serves as the director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, a university-wide research institute promoting interdisciplinary study of questions that affect our ability to lead valuable, meaningful lives. And these are obviously very, very important issues in our society, and not just as a theoretical exercise, but also because they affect our everyday life. And so the interdisciplinary study of those issues is obviously very important. And even yesterday, just as a side note, she helped 75 faculty and staff of the University of Minnesota to think about these very questions. We had a wonderful roundtable discussion with 75 people attending to think about the question, what does it mean to flourish at the university? And it was just a wonderful evening. Tonight, in this lecture titled Loving Strangers, a Modern Philosophical Defense, we will hear about her musings on the Jesus parable of the Good Samaritan. And we are so thankful that you're here, that you have joined us for 2 days. And we're eager to spend time with students, with faculty, and now with all of us right here. And we are actually eager to hear from you what you have to tell us and share with us tonight. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Meghan Sullivan.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you so much. Can you guys all hear me? Does it sound good in the back? Wonderful. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I've been to the Twin Cities a bunch of times, but this is actually my first visit to the University of Minnesota, and it has been such a warm and wonderful philosophical community. I've loved getting to know all the students and faculty, and it's a pleasure tonight to share with you, inflict on you, some work that I've been doing over the last few years, thinking about reasons for love, which might, if you're not a philosopher, sound like a really obvious topic for moral philosophy. But if you are in academic philosophy, you might realize how little ethicists nowadays talk about love or think of it as being the subject of philosophical speculation. Love is obviously a really important part of each of our lives, but I think at least the consensus in 21st century United States is that it's a deeply personal part of our life and not a part of our life that's necessarily governed by reasons or the kind of thing that you could criticize somebody for how they love another person or fail to love another person. It's so personal that it's not the kind of thing people should give lectures about. But I'm even going to do one further. I've been trying to write an extremely judgmental book about our love lives. Partially because I think that these questions are philosophically very interesting and that a lot of our views don't sit well together. Philosophers are very good at cleaning up those kinds of problems. But also because I think that philosophy can play a really important role in helping us address some of our habits and attitudes that are keeping us from flourishing. And by thinking and having discussions with other people about a topic like your reasons for love and what role love plays in your moral life, you might gradually become even better at loving people. And that could make your life so much more richer. So that's kind of a little preface for this book. I made like 100 slides and was told this is a 40-minute talk. I have a lot of things I want to share with you. So my plan is to just say increasingly controversial things about the ethics of love until I run out of time. And then we're going to have Q&A. And if you're not upset by like the 10-minute mark, you're not paying attention. So that's the kind of plan for this talk. And it's not, if you think it's going to land with some big conclusion, you're just going to have to read the book when I finish writing it. So that's the Holmer Lecture. So I started thinking about this for a lot of different reasons, but one thing that got me going was just noticing stories in the New York Times specifically about good Samaritans and bad Samaritans and how the New York Times judged harshly or favorably what people did in these different cases. So there's one case from just a couple of years ago. This photographer died on the streets of Paris, and he had, I think, a heart condition, and he was ailing for quite some time, and people just kept walking right by. Nobody stopped to help and save this guy's life. And so the New York Times runs a story of like, what's wrong with Parisians? They're, confirming our hypothesis, they're horrible people. There was a story that hit a little bit closer to home a few years ago. Candace Payne, She's a resident of Chicago. Chicago, like the Twin Cities and South Bend, has absolutely horrible winters, and we had a polar vortex that blew through a few years ago, froze all the pipes in my house. It was a complete nightmare. Candace Payne found out the polar vortex was coming through. She went to a local hotel on the south side, gave them her credit card, took out 30 hotel rooms, and then went and rounded up 30 homeless men and women and families from the south side and put them up for 2 nights in that hotel room. Not only did she do that, but she made gift baskets for all the families and left them in the hotel room. And then she was interviewed by the New York Times about just this act of incredible generosity. And Candace, actually, her story is the one that really got me thinking about this as philosophy. If I convince you guys of anything tonight, it's just to pay more attention to these stories as possible data points for doing moral philosophy. And what I noticed about Candace was when she was giving interviews about what she had done, she really downplayed her own moral heroism. She's like, I think anybody could do this. I'm kind of confused why more people don't do this more often. She took on credit card debt to put all of these homeless people up for that winter. I, in the meantime, had bought a bunch of groceries at Whole Foods and was just trying to figure out what to do with my own pipes. I wasn't concerned at all that same winter for anything that was happening to my fellow man in South Bend. But Candace really downplays it. And she's like, I'm just an ordinary person. I think anybody would do what I did in these circumstances. This doesn't really merit being in the New York Times. And you think, well, no, it's kind of heroic, but I'm trying to figure out exactly what's heroic about it. Another case, and this is the one I probably spend the most time on in the book, is a little bit more controversial. I mean, Candace Payne's story kind of warms our hearts. She's great. I'm glad she lives in Chicago. Sometimes people engage in Samaritanism, and it's actually controversial. So Teresa Todd, she's a lawyer. She lives in Marfa, Texas, so kind of in the West Texas area near the southern border. She has 2 kids, 2 teenagers. She's driving home one night, and she sees these 3 teenagers who are clearly crossing the southern border illegally. And the eldest, who's about 19 years old, runs out in front of her car and waves her down and is clearly in distress. She immediately stops. She notices that one of the 3 teenagers is very sick, very dehydrated. And she bundles up the 3 kids. She puts them in the back of her car. She cranks up the heater. She starts giving them snacks. And she calls her friend who also works in the Border Patrol area, but has children just like Teresa Todd does. And she's talking with her friend about what she should do with these 3 kids that she just picked up crossing the southern border. And Border Patrol pulls up behind her about 2 minutes later and arrests her. And the issue for Border Patrol was that Teresa Todd should have known that there's exactly one thing that you're allowed to do when you see people crossing the southern border illegally, and that is to immediately call for help from the U.S. Border Patrol. You can't put those people into your car. You can't give them snacks. You can't care for them. You can't call your friends and ask advice about what you should do. And Teresa Todd knows this. She's a lawyer. So the Border Patrol arrested her on charges of harboring. And it made the New York Times, and there was a huge public outcry about whether what she had done was morally great or whether or not she was flaunting the law on the southern border. And eventually she wasn't released. They held her cell phone for 30 days, but she was released without charges. We can have a big debate about policy at the southern border, and in fact there is an intense debate happening right now in our country on still exactly this issue. What I'm interested in as a philosopher is one quote in this New York Times story, and that is where Teresa Todd gives her argument to the reporters about why she stopped to help those kids. And so the argument, it appears in this article, and it's a very simple argument. It seems deceptively simple, but in all of her subsequent interviews, she reiterates this is morally why she stopped to help those kids. She says, I've got kids. That kid that was in the road that stopped me looks like my kid, and I thought, my God, my kids, and I stopped to help him. I moved to help him exactly the same way I would if that was my own teenage son flogging me down in an emergency. That was her thinking. And as a philosopher, I read the New York Times in a very judgy way. I'm like, is that a good argument? I mean, she could have given it, she's a lawyer, she could have given a really complex legal argument for why she stopped. She could have said it was an act of resistance against the Sessions era policy around immigration control. She didn't give any of those arguments. Her argument was, he looked like my kid. My kid, I've got to help my kid. I think that there is a sophisticated kind of argument or reasoning that's going on behind her decision. And I think this is the kind of argument that's going on behind Samaritanism more broadly. And it's interesting, and philosophers should pay a lot more attention to it, because it helps us ask some really interesting questions about what role love plays in our moral life. And a really big question, certainly one of the core questions in Christian ethics: when and why is it appropriate to love a complete stranger in such a way that you would even risk your own freedom or well-being on their behalf? Which is what Teresa Todd did in this case. Philosophers like arguments, and they like to try to identify the kind of key principles that somebody's using. I think that there are two principles in Teresa Todd's style argument. I don't know if she would endorse these, but this is what I think she's working on in her moral framework when she decided to stop. The first principle we might call a foundational love principle, which is at its root just the principle that love provides a good reason to do something for another person. Love is morally significant. The fact that I love someone else gives me an important moral reason to help them. Maybe that seems uncontroversial to you, but I'm going to make it controversial, so don't worry. Second principle is a principle that I might call non-arbitrariness. And this is basically the principle that if you've got two options and they are exactly similar in every respect you think matters morally, then you should have the same attitude towards both of those options. You shouldn't draw arbitrary differences when it comes to your moral life. You should try to get rid of arbitrariness when you encounter it in your moral life. This is a very controversial principle in ethics, but it's one that I actually happen to believe, and I'm going to try to defend it in a little bit. But the idea behind non-arbitrariness is if Teresa Todd thinks, morally speaking, there's no important difference between the teenager who flagged her down on the side of the road and her own teenager, whatever it takes to morally love someone, both of those people have it, then it makes sense. She's justified in treating that stranger in exactly the same way that she would treat her own beloved son. So that's the second principle I think is going on here. We're going to probably spend the most time thinking about what it would mean to have a non-arbitrariness principle in our love lives in this talk until I run out of time. So I also thought, because I'm a Catholic, I read the stories and I was noticing the Good Samaritan parable, stopping by to the side of the road for somebody injured with Candace Payne. There's a hotel involved. It's like, I've heard this story before. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is in like chief Socrates mode. He's talking to all of his disciples. He's explaining to them how to go about spreading his ministry to all of the towns that they're about to go visit. And a scholar of the law, aka an annoying philosophy grad student, comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, I've been thinking a lot about the greatest commandment, and I just wanted to know, what do I need to do to inherit this eternal life that you're promising to all of your followers? And Jesus is no fool, but he decides to engage in the kind of Socratic conversation with this young scholar of the law. So then we get the setup for the famous parable. Jesus says, there's the greatest commandment. Jesus said, well, you know the greatest commandment, scholar of the law. What's written in it? And the scholar of the law says, well, the core of Jewish ethical life is that we will love the Lord our God with all of our heart and all of our mind and all of our strength, and that we'll love our neighbor as ourselves. And Jesus says, great, why are you bothering me? You know the answer to the question. But, as a philosophy grad student questioning Jesus, he's like, I've got a follow-up question. Who is my neighbor? Who am I obligated to love? And Jesus then shares the story of the Good Samaritan. So a man, we're meant to believe he's a Jew, is beaten when he's on the super dangerous Jericho road, and he's left by the side of the road to die. And a priest who's on his way to serve in the temple sees the body but just passes right on by, doesn't bother to stop. Levite sees the body, passes right on by, doesn't bother to stop. And then a Samaritan comes by, is moved with pity, is moved with compassion, and it's not just a simple kind of pity, it's the kind of pity that the father felt for the prodigal son in that parable when the son finally came home. It's the same kind of word in Greek that Jesus felt when he found out Lazarus had died. Like it was moved in his gut by this guy's plight. And he stops to help. Not only does he stop to help, but he pulls a Candace Payne. He bundles the man up, puts him on his donkey, takes him to a nearby inn, nurses him throughout the night with the very best medicines he could find. Then on the way out, goes to the innkeeper and says, I will pay over and above any expense that this man incurs until he is made whole again. That's extraordinary generosity for a complete stranger. And Jesus says, what's the lesson that you take from this parable? Who was a neighbor to the injured man? And the scholar says, well, clearly the Samaritan. And then Jesus really puts the kicker in. He doesn't just say, look at the Samaritan. What a great guy. We should write a New York Times story about him. He says, go and do likewise. Yeah, if you want to follow the greatest commandment, the central core duty, the foundational love principle of Judeo-Christian ethics, you need to do what this guy did, which seems like, this is one of Jesus' more radical moments because that guy really went overboard for the stranger. So how do we interpret this? Been thinking about this question a lot. Now you got my huge wind-up. I wasted half the talk on why I'm curious about this. Now we want to do philosophy about the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a great way to take all the spiritual joy out of the Gospel of Luke. It's let's try to break down in a really precise way the principles that Jesus could possibly want to use to argue for this idea that we have to perform such extraordinary love for strangers. And what could this mean? So it gives you a bit of my thinking. A little bit more about the Samaritans, or just one nitpicky thing that I want to put on your radar, because I do think that this is an important parable for those of us who are thinking about what's happening on the southern border right now. A lot of presentations of the parable of the Good Samaritan, we think of the Jew, we just assume that the injured man was Jewish, and we think that the Samaritan and the Jew were just complete strangers. They were in radically different ethnic groups. They would have never encountered each other before, and they'll never encounter each other again. This was just a one-off rescue mission. And that's probably not a fair reading of this gospel or the right way to understand what strangers are for the purpose of thinking about this moral question. Why do I say this? Well, if you read around in the Gospels, even just in the Gospel of Luke, there are Samaritans everywhere. Jesus is talking to Samaritans all the time. Sometimes he's giving them advice. Sometimes he's just engaging with them as kind of secondary characters in his ministry. But Samaritans are all over this region that Jesus is moving through at the time. So it's not like they were really far away or distant aliens. They were, in a sense, already neighbors. They were living in close proximity. It's just that the Samaritans and the Judeans had a really complicated relationship. The Samaritans asked to help rebuild the Second Temple, and the Jewish leadership were no, we don't want your help. And then there was resentment between the two communities. There was a lot of questions about who belonged where. So as we think about what it means for the Jew and the Samaritan in this case to be strangers to one another, I don't think we should interpret it as the Samaritan was a traveler or a tourist passing through the Jericho Road area. These were people that were strangers to each other because they had not cultivated any kind of relationship or love for one another. And their communities were, in fact, creating barriers to developing that kind of love, but they were interacting quite a bit. So that's an important data point. I'd like you guys to think a little bit about what it means for somebody to genuinely be a stranger. All right, so now we're ready to break it down. I'm just going to talk about what Samaritanism is controversial, but we'll circle back to that at the end of the talk. I'm writing this book. I'm not going to tell you the whole book today because I haven't finished it and because we're already running out of time. But there's kind of a few acts to the argument that motivates this philosophy book I've been working on. First, I want to remind all of my philosophical audience, and maybe those of you who haven't thought about love philosophically for a while, that it is really puzzling to figure out what kinds of reasons we could possibly have for loving another person. Why do we love the people that we already love? And how do we think about that question about just what love is as an attitude? I want to go through some of those puzzles to just remind you, we can be shocked a little bit by Jesus' teaching and the kind of non-arbitrariness principle that Jesus seems to be putting forward. But all of the other explanations for where we get our reasons for loving other people are also pretty crazy. It's just hard to understand the role that love plays in our life. I'm going to spend most of the rest of this talk helping you feel that pressure. Second part of the talk is trying to introduce a theory about why it might make moral sense to think that we have a very strong obligation to love absolutely everyone. I call this moral theory agapeism, agapic love, based on the Greek word that captures the kind of love that seems to be commanded in Judeo-Christian ethics. But I don't think you have to have any special divine revelation or be part of any particular religious tradition to think that this idea that we have these universal reasons for love is a really interesting philosophical idea that might be defended by principles that absolutely anybody could endorse. So another goal that I have for this book is for people to realize that this element of Christian ethics can just be part of our debates about ethics more broadly. And it's not the case that people who already are in a particular religious tradition or feel like they've got some special revelation about goodness from God can believe these principles. We can just discuss them and argue about them. In fact, I think it's telling that Teresa Todd, who invokes this kind of Samaritan argument for her decision, is not a particularly religious person. She's not a practicing Christian. She was raised in a Christian household, and she's aware of these teachings. But she believes in this argument because she just believes that this is the heart of moral life, not because she thinks that it's a way of expressing her particular devotion to God. So I'm interested in that. What sense can Christian ethics also be in just deep conversation with ethics that's not part of a religious tradition? The final parts of the book try to apply this kind of ethics of love to a bunch of complicated questions. I just wrote a piece about abortion that came out in Commonweal that looks at Samaritanism in that debate. I'm very interested in, obviously, politics at the southern border and ways of maybe reviving and making weirder some ways that Christians have participated in these moral debates. I'm not going to talk about any of those tonight, but I'm happy to answer questions if you've got them. The last part of the book deals with the major problem for this moral theory, which is that it is insanely demanding. If you actually believe that this is true, then the vast majority of our daily habits don't seem to conform at all with this moral teaching, and you've got to deal with the fact that you are an abject moral failure. And so what do we do with that? And how embarrassing is that for a philosophical view? That's a question I'm deeply concerned with. So now I've spoiled the whole book for you. You should still buy it whenever I finish writing it, and it's sold. Let's talk about arbitrariness. I am so going to run out of time. That's all right. This part is going to be fun just by itself. So, arbitrariness. In most parts of ethics, arbitrariness is clearly bad, and once you realize that there's arbitrariness in your preferences or your desires or your actions, and somebody points it out to you, you should try to stop being so arbitrary. I thought there was a really great example of this during COVID. The New York Times had this dynamic news page where they would just point out all of the arbitrariness and who had access to COVID vaccines. So people in very, very similar circumstances. You're a kindergarten teacher in Mexico City. You're a kindergarten teacher in Berlin. You have exactly the same exposure to COVID-y little kids. But in one place, you can get the vaccine right away, and in another place, you have no hope of getting the vaccine anytime in the near future. Like pregnant women in one country have access to it, pregnant women in another country do not. And the New York Times would just go through this long list of who has it and who doesn't. And as you read it, you're meant to think, like, the world is grossly unfair. Like, this is so ridiculous. People shouldn't live or die based on what particular country they live in or which particular occupation they have. This arbitrariness is bad. So, arbitrariness in ethics, students, if you're taking notes, normally bad. That's how you win a philosophical argument, is showing that your opponent has really arbitrary reasons for picking one option rather than another. The one exception to this over the last 100 years has been the case of love and friendship. A lot of philosophers have gone to extraordinary lengths to defend the fact that we just love some people and we don't love other people. And at the end of the day, there's probably not a big difference between the people that we love and the people that we don't when it comes to whatever matters for dignity or morality or value. But that's just how it is. And then they're going to build a theory of love that defends this kind of really thoroughgoing partiality. This has also started to annoy me quite a bit. It's like, why is love this one dimension of our moral lives that gets this extreme partiality allowed? But every other part of morality, when you find out you're really arbitrary, is like bad news. So you read into it, and actually for about 2,300 years, philosophers have been struggling with this issue, and they've come up with different theories about what it is about other people that gives us a reason to love them. And it turns out that all of these theories are pretty controversial. It's just hard to figure out why we have any reasons for loving other people, even why it would be okay for us not to have reasons. So let's look at a couple of these examples, and just seeing these examples and their problems will also hopefully make us a little bit more sympathetic with Jesus' radical point. If you were a philosopher audience, I'd spend a while just going through really boring way the non-arbitrariness principle, but I'll save that for when Alan asks his question eventually. Here's a first philosopher I want to introduce you to, or the first view that's attributed to a philosopher. I don't even really think this is Aristotle's view, but a lot of people think this is Aristotle's view. So we'll call it a vaguely Aristotelian view about love. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, 2,300 years ago, he's teaching his class about the good life in the Lyceum. And in the middle part of the class, he turns to love and friendship. And he's advising his students about how to have better friendships. And he tells them that the best form of friendship for the good life is friendship of virtue. And when you love somebody in this virtuous way, when you have philia towards somebody in this virtuous way, you love them because of their virtue. Their virtuous characteristics, their good qualities are the reason why you love them. That's what merits your love. And if you love somebody for their virtue and then their virtue goes away, then so too should your philia recede. You shouldn't love them anymore because you've lost the thing that's worth loving them about. So this is sometimes called the quality theory. I do not think this is actually Aristotle's theory of love, but he does say in this one bit that if you accept a friend as a good person and then that friend becomes vicious, you should dump them. So he said that one bit, and so it seems like at one point at least, he believed something like this. So if you're this version of Aristotle, you do not have problems with arbitrariness because you think what makes somebody good or worthy of love is their goodness, whether they're generous or funny or courageous. And just as you say, like, I love Coke Zero more than I love regular Coke because it tastes exactly the same as regular Coke, but it's healthier. That seems to be a totally non-arbitrary, very rational soda preference. This version of Aristotle says that's exactly how it works with people too. So you love somebody in virtue of their courage, in virtue of the things that make them lovable as a great example of humanity, and if they lose those things, love them less. Same way if it turns out Coke Zero is really unhealthy, stop drinking it. So Aristotle wouldn't have a problem with arbitrariness. The problem is this, and every commentator after Aristotle was like, this seems like a crazy way of describing how our love lives work. This just doesn't seem to be what a good person does with respect to their friends and the people that they love. Why is that? I could give you 10 counterexamples to Aristotle's theory, but I'll give you 4 to get you warmed up. So here's one problem for the quality theory. It's sometimes called in the literature the substitution problem. So you've got Tyler and Cameron Winklevoss here. They're identical twins, and they're also just very, very, very similar men. You might know them from the Social Network movie. They have a lot of cryptocurrency money right now. They're both very handsome. They're very courageous. They're very wealthy. All the old Greek virtues, they've got them in spades. They're like Olympic rowers. The Greeks would have loved the Winklevoss twins. So let's suppose that I love Cameron Winklevoss. I met him at a conference at the University of Minnesota, and we really hit it off, and I came to love him for his courage and his wealth and his Olympic abilities and his good looks. All of his qualities caused me to decide I love Cameron Winklevoss. I have philia towards him. It's a friendship kind of love. And then Cameron is killed in a freak accident, rowing his canoe or whatever, rowing his boat. I was dared to say that during my talk. And at the funeral, I meet Tyler Winklevoss. He has all of the same qualities as Cameron. Aristotle's theory should predict that I just transfer my same love and intensity onto Tyler as I do to Cameron. It's like discovering another flavor of Coke Zero. It should just move, because the thing I ever admired about Cameron was that he was a receptacle for courage and virtue and generosity and good looks and Olympic prowess. But it doesn't work that, like nobody, none of my students at least have this intuition of like discovering that there's a clone of the person that you loved means that you should automatically love that same clone with the same intensity. It just doesn't seem to be like, love is like particular to a person in a way that doesn't let it transfer the way the quality theory seems like it would. But it gets worse. So, I love Cameron Winklevoss because of his courage and his good looks and his wealth and his Olympic abilities. But then, AJ makes me aware of the existence of Ryan Gosling, who has all of those qualities, but to a much higher degree than Cameron Winklevoss does. He's much better looking, he's much more courageous, he's much more generous, much funnier. And you might think I have a limited economy of attention and love in my life, so I ought to feel pressure on Aristotle's theory to move up in the world from Cameron to Ryan. I should dump Cameron and trade up for Ryan. But teenage girls do this all the time. They trade up their friends. They become another option, a better option becomes socially available, and they dump their current friends and move up. And we think that this is vicious. This is actually a horrible character trait in these people. There's something about love and friendship that also ought to have a certain amount of steadfastness. You should stick with people. Even if Cameron is injured and loses some of his good looks and some of his Olympic prowess, that's a reason to double down on my loyalty and friendship to him and not to start looking for Ryan Gosling. So that seems to be another problem. Aristotle just doesn't predict the fact that we don't think trading up is a morally right thing to do. But it gets even worse. So I've got Ryan Gosling, but then Brian makes me aware of the existence of Pope Francis, who misses some of the quasi-good virtues of Ryan. He's not quite as handsome. I feel bad saying that. But he's got moral virtue coming out his ears. His morally significant virtue is so much better than Ryan's that I ought to love Pope Francis even more than I love Ryan Gosling. But, for a lot of people, you admire Pope Francis, you admire Mother Teresa, but if you asked me, Megan, do you want to be best friends with Ryan Gosling or with Pope Francis? You can only pick one. I might, if I'm kind of a horrible person, tell you I kind of want Ryan. Pope Francis is he's such a morally virtuous person. He's such a great guy. But I don't want him to be friends with me because one of the things that I enjoy about friendship is telling horrible jokes about people. And sometimes doing mean things together. Smoking cigarettes and talking about Blake Lively. That's stuff that I could do with Ryan, partially because he's got some vice, but I can't do it with Pope Francis because he's so far above me morally that it's going to be hard for me to enjoy the goods of friendship with him or love with him. I don't actually even want to trade up as high as Pope Francis. That also seems to be a problem for Aristotle, or a problem for me, depending on how you look at it. There's also, I think, really interesting questions about Aristotle overthinking love in this case. And this is something that I also want to come back to eventually when I ever try to wrap up this talk. Aristotle thinks that we have to have a lot of reasons, at least in this quality theory, for why we love the person that we love. So AJ says to me, why do you love your niece Kale so much? That's my little niece Kale. And I say, well, I think she's got a lot of courage that's kind of building up, and I think that she's going to be really generous. I've got these little early indicators for Kale about how this is going to go. And so I start to spin out this theory of my niece that tries to justify why I love her so much. It's up for AJ to say, if that's how much thinking you have to do about why you love your niece, there's something deformed about your love for your niece. There's something about love when it functions as a really significant reason for us that we don't overthink it. The love itself is the reason for why we buy special Christmas presents for her or why I think so much about her and don't think about other one-year-olds. So you might think that Aristotle's theory, this is Bernard Williams' objection, requires us to have one thought too many about the people that we love in order to morally justify all the things that we do for them. So we've been building out Aristotle's theory, or the version of Aristotle that tries to justify why we love some people more than others on non-arbitrary grounds, but it just doesn't seem like a very good theory of why we love the people that we love. Can we do better? I'm going to try to race through some other options. A lot of philosophers have thought that we could do better. One option, now we're skipping ahead to the 1990s, which are going way further in the future. Harry Frankfurt, he's a philosopher at Princeton. He has a book about reasons for love where he argues for a kind of non-rationalist theory of love. And this is, a lot of my students intuitively think initially this is the right theory of love. I think it's got major problems, but I'll put it out there. Frankfurt's theory, in just a brief nutshell, he thinks that when we first start loving anybody, there's no reason whatsoever why we love them. We just see them and we might feel drawn to them. Maybe it's biological inclination if they're your own children, or maybe you just had a great conversation in a bar one time in St. Paul and you just decided I'm going to pursue this person. I'm going to pay attention to this person. And then once that non-rational act of loving a person starts up, then your attention starts to create or construct reasons for loving them. And love has this ability to kind of construct its own reasons in really interesting and morally significant ways. And there's a lot of, then there's a huge moral theory that shows why that could be possible. This might sound like a good theory because it's kind of the polar opposite of Aristotle. You don't need any reasons to start loving anybody whatsoever. You just start loving them and then the morality comes afterward. But I think there are interesting problems for Frankfurt as well. One problem, and this one my students also disagree with me about, but I write about it in the book and I think about it quite a bit, is for many of us, if we start to notice a bias in our love lives, or it's pointed out to us, we feel some moral pressure to get rid of that bias. At least I do. So we live in the age of friendship and love that's mediated by big data, for better or for worse. There are all kinds of interesting studies that show that online dating sites like OkCupid and Match.com, sites that connect people up for initial encounters that might lead to certain kinds of love, also exhibit really odious racialized preferences. So if you are a black or an Asian man on one of these dating sites, there are far fewer people that are willing to initiate any kind of conversation with you or reach out to you or try to establish a relationship with you. What do we make of that? If you discovered that you had this highly racialized pattern to who you might engage with in social media, either on a dating site or maybe on a platform like Facebook, and this was finally pointed out to you, would you feel fine about that arbitrariness? Would you think it's a morally acceptable answer to say well, I'm just attracted to whoever I'm attracted to. I'm interested in whatever kind of person I'm interested in. It happens to be that I have this pattern of 90% of the time really only being interested in white people. But non-rationalism, that's how it goes. I don't owe any reason why I'm initially attracted or interested in any other person. I just have the inclinations that I have. And then acting on that pattern creates a moral justification for loving those people and not loving the people that I'm not attracted to. This seems like a problem for the view, at least for those of us who feel when we realize that there are these racial biases in our patterns of caring about other people, we think that this might be problematic, something that we want to work on. Maybe we can't work on it in an individual way, but we'd want to change some aspects of our society that help us get rid of those racialized preferences. A non-rationalist theory like Frankfurt's is going to struggle to explain why we feel that kind of pressure, if you feel it. And again, some people always want to argue with me that they don't feel it at all. Happy to talk about that. I think another issue, and this will come back because it's a problem that's shared with other theories of reasons of love, is trying to explain why good moral agents sometimes try to get the arbitrariness out of their attention and their relationships. So another big theory of love, this is another one that comes back to the late 90s but has remained really popular, is what's called the relationship theory of love, and it's a bit similar to the one that Frankfurt offered, but it's more specific. According to the relationship theory, your moral reasons for loving another person come from the historical relationship that you've cultivated with that person. So it's not totally just random. It's not the case that any kind of attention towards another person generates reasons for love. But relationships are the thing that give us moral reasons for how we treat other people. So, if you're familiar with ethics of care work in the 1980s, or if you think a lot about feminist ethics, probably the relationship theory seems like a natural theory for you. It also has problems, and some of these might be obvious. two that I would like to point out, and both of these relationship theorists will have things to say, so there's a more sophisticated debate happening in the background, but I just want to start it here. One problem is distinguishing moral relationships from immoral relationships. And if you think that relationships give rise to our moral reasons, then it's really hard to have moral criticism of those same relationships. You end up in this like tight little circle and your head explodes. So let me give you one example. The relationship theory says that somebody gets a reason to love another person because they have this ongoing historical connection of pursuing a relationship towards that other person. Let's suppose that we've got two bullies here, or no, we've got one bully here and his victim. We've got Slick, he's the bully, and Poindexter, he's the victim. And here's the deal with Poindexter. Poindexter really wants Slick to love him. He wants to be in a relationship with this bully. Like, he really wants this bully's attention. He wants to be part of this friend group. He wants acceptance from this bully. And the bully is willing to be in a relationship with Poindexter, namely a relationship where he constantly seeks out Poindexter and humiliates him. So they have an ongoing historical relationship, a connection that Poindexter actually wants. He wants a relationship to exist. Does this relationship of being the bully's victim give Poindexter a reason to love his bully? I mean, a lot of us intuitively have the feeling like, no, absolutely not. In fact, the fact of bullying, the toxicity of this relationship, and the fact that Poindexter's dignity is constantly suppressed in this relationship is a really good reason for him not to love his bully. So the relationship theory owes us some explanation for how we're going to get rid of like the abusive cases where the relationship itself is actually morally problematic, and separate it out from the cases where we think the fact that you've pursued a relationship with somebody is a reason to stick with them, a reason to not trade up or substitute them, which are Aristotle's problems. Does that make sense? Oh, yeah, I mean, like, then the nuclear problem for the relationship theory, by the way, is the freaking parable of the Good Samaritan. So the relationship theory says that a reason for love for another person has to come about from a relationship that's being established or has already been established with that person. And the whole interesting puzzle with Teresa Todd and with Candace Payne and with Jesus' parable is the thought that, oh my gosh, some people at least seem to have this ability to be moved by love in a morally significant way to make a great sacrifice for another person. How could we possibly explain that if our only reasons for love that are morally significant are reasons of relationship? The whole interesting thing about the parable of the Good Samaritan is that these guys didn't have at least anything that resembled a traditional relationship. So that's a puzzle. There's one more theory I'm going to put on deck, and then we're going to have plenty to argue about. I'm going to land you with my moral theory, and then you'll have tons of objections. But one theory that I've been thinking about quite recently comes from Kieran Setia. He's a moral philosopher at MIT. He wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago trying to explain partiality in love and why those partial reasons could still be the basis of making moral decisions. So Setia's line is he's trying to make sense of the fact that we do feel the weight of the one thought too many problem. We think if somebody gives us an argument like, why did you stay up all night helping your son finish his science fair project, but there's no way that you'd be willing to stay up all night to help other kids finish science fair projects? And you say, well, it's not because my kid is going to win a Nobel Prize, and it's not because his project is particularly great. The reason I stayed up all night is because I love him. Like, I love my son, therefore I made some great sacrifice for him. Setia thinks that's a great argument. How do we understand why that's a great argument, but you wouldn't feel the pressure to stay up all night to help other kids finish their science projects? What Setia says is you shouldn't try to find some special feature of your kid that makes him worthy of investment in science projects. That's a losing proposition for all the reasons we've seen. But you should realize that the reason you love your kid is not because he's a scientific genius. It's just because he has human dignity. He's a person. That's all. That's the only reason any of us need to love another human. But that reason that his dignity gives you for loving him is what Setia calls a non-insistent reason and not an insistent reason. And what do I mean by that? This will be the one most complicated philosophical point you get today, but it's going to be relevant to how we start to finally announce the moral theory that I think undergirds Jesus' teaching. For Setia, he makes this distinction between insistent and non-insistent reasons, and this has to do with how we become aware of something in the world that's morally significant, and it changes how we think or act. So an insistent reason is what, until about 3 minutes ago, you probably just thought a reason was. An insistent reason is a fact about the world, something about the world that you live in, that once you discover it's true, puts some pressure on you to respond to it. One example, a simple example maybe of an insistent reason is I'm trying to give Brian reasons to be a vegetarian. So I start telling him just true things about the world, the moral world and the physical world. I say, look, Brian, eating plants is way healthier than eating meat. And also, if more people became vegetarians, then the climate crisis would have a better shot of being solved. And also, there's more delicious vegetarian foods that are being produced every week in the Twin Cities. And if you start buying more of them, then there's going to be even more delicious vegetarian meals. Each one of those things, as I tell Brian, he becomes aware of that, he should feel more and more pressure to be a vegetarian. Those reasons add up and they put pressure on him to respond to them. Setia says that's not how our reasons of love work. We have reasons for love, but that's not how they work. When we have reasons for love, as we become aware of them, they give us permission to act on them, but they don't put any pressure on us whatsoever. Setia doesn't give this example in his paper, but one thing philosophers try to do is build the strongest case for a view that they want to reject. And I think there's a strong case to be made for Setia's view of love. Here's one way of looking at it. There's a big puzzle, a long-standing puzzle in ethics, for how we could ever possibly have reasons to create other people. So let's suppose I'm talking to my brother Patrick. You guys just got to see a little picture of my niece, Kale. My brother and sister-in-law are thinking about having another child. I'm a judgy older sister, so I call Patrick on the phone and be like, I'm going to give you some reasons to have a kid. Reason number one, you guys are pretty good parents, and if you had another kid, you would love being parents even more. So reason one, you'd love it. You'd love being a two-kid family. Reason number two, people love existing. So if you created that person and he came into existence, once he became aware that he was existing, he'd be pretty happy about that, and that would be a good thing. So reason number two, people like to exist. Reason number three, demographic challenges in the state of Virginia. There aren't enough kids being born. You guys could help reverse that trend by creating another Virginian. That's a reason to do it. I'm giving reasons the same way I'm giving Brian reasons to become a vegetarian. But a lot of us have the feeling I can give my brother these reasons, but as each one, if he receives it on the other end of the phone, becomes aware of the way this could change the world, he shouldn't feel pressure to have a kid, the same way Brian might feel pressure to become a vegetarian. The best way to understand what my reasons are doing is just saying these would all be great reasons to have a kid. And if you decide to have a kid, and you reference this reason, good on you. You've done something morally significant. But if you decide to ignore all these reasons, that's also totally fine, because these reasons are not pressure reasons the way that ordinary reasons are. Kieran Setia argues in this really interesting work that other people's dignity gives us these no-pressure reasons to love them everywhere. You guys all have, in virtue of your human dignity, are giving me permission to love you, in Setia's view, but no pressure. I can decide which of those reasons I want to pick, or none of them. I could decide to not love any of you jerks. And so it's an interesting question, does this capture? It captures partiality. It doesn't have any of Aristotle's problems. It gives us reasons for love. It doesn't require relationships. Is this a good account of our reasons for love? It's obviously going to have problems explaining why Samaritanism might be a moral duty, but Kieran Setia is not a Christian philosopher. He probably thinks Samaritanism is crazy. He thinks that Teresa Todd had a non-insistent reason to stop to help that kid on the side of the road, and she chose to act on it, but she could have just as easily kept driving, and that would have also been morally fine. Setia really leans into the arbitrariness puzzle. I think this is one of the most interesting parts of his paper, and we are starting to wrap up if AJ's getting nervous. Setia, somebody points out this counterexample to his puzzle. Philosophers do these really fanciful thought experiments that would never happen in real life, but help you tell whether you think somebody's view sounds true or not. Here's a counterexample that Setia fights about in the paper. He says, suppose I wake up one morning and I discover within myself that I love my preschool-age son. Of course, I love my kid. And I also love this one other kid in his class. I don't act on that love in an inappropriate way. I don't behave like I'm that kid's father. I don't try to pick him up from school or do any of the things that would be inappropriate given our lack of a relationship. But I just love that one random kid, and I love my own kid, and I don't love any of the other kids in his class. Is there something wrong with me? And Setia says, according to my view, no. Your son has dignity, and that's why you love him, and you also have a relationship with him and some duties of care as his father, and that gives you special moral obligations. That other kid, he's got dignity, so that's a sufficient reason to love him. It's a non-insistent reason, so the fact that that kid is like just, there's no difference between that kid and any of your son's other classmates means that it's also totally fine to just choose to love that particular kid but not to love any of his classmates. Setia kind of wrestles with this puzzle and at the end of the day says, yep, that's my view. This is how this theory of love works. I was reading this and I was thinking back to the more odious versions of this case. So what if somebody like Setia realizes he loves his kid and he loves all the kids in the same racial group as his son, but he doesn't love the other kids in the class that are in a different racial group? Do we still feel like that's an acceptable consequence of his view? Or do we think, no, that kind of arbitrariness is really bad? Like if you discover that within yourself, you really should work on your love life. Like you should think that there's something wrong with how you behold or appreciate or contemplate these kids. I also think that there's this general worry of whether we've given too much away in trying to defend the partiality of loving people that we in fact love and not loving strangers, when in fact we should have been thinking a little bit more about whether or not we in fact could do a better job of responding to the reasons of love that strangers might give us. So that turns a corner into the next phase of this book, which will be a whole other talk next year. But one thing I'd like to just lay out for you guys is the final moral theory. So I talked to those two principles at the beginning, and you can see how these principles have recurred again and again in these different debates about where our reasons for love come from. Here's the ultimate view that I think might be true as a moral theory. At least I think this might be what I really believe about love and our moral obligations. And it's a very radical theory. I think it's inspired by the material in the Gospel of Luke, but I also think there's lots of reasons for people who are not that interested in scriptural accounts of ethics to be curious about whether these might just be the best way of understanding where our reasons of love come from. So here are the three principles, and if you're a great philosophy student, you should immediately start figuring out which one of these you want to reject. But here are the three principles. First, I think, and I said this, I believed this for a while, a really important part of being moral and having moral attitudes is realizing that when arbitrariness is pointed out to you in your attitudes, you try to get rid of it. So if you discover, you go through your Facebook account when you get home tonight, and you discover that you have this really strong pattern of only being willing to initiate online friendships with people of your same racial group, and you think that race has nothing to do with friendship, like it shouldn't have anything to do with friendship, then you should try to change your patterns of friendship. Like that's, I think, just part of how moral people adapt and scrutinize their reasons and live an examined life. And I think that's certainly true in other things. When the New York Times points out to me how arbitrary access to COVID vaccines is, I should get upset because justice should put pressure on us to try to eliminate arbitrariness, and we should act on the things that are morally significant. It's a controversial view, but that's one that I believe. Second principle is the idea that there are situations, like the situation the Good Samaritan found himself in, like the situation of deciding I don't need any extra reason to explain to you why I care for my niece. Situations where love itself provides a really significant moral reason for what we're doing or hoping or wanting. Love can be a moral reason. Love's not exempt from morality in any special way. Also a controversial view, but one that I think has a lot of attraction. And then the final part, and this really only came to my mind when I started reading Setia, is this idea that I don't think reasons for love are just reasons of permission. I think they're the kinds of reasons that once we become aware of them, we ought to feel moral pressure to respond to. I have not given you a big argument for that third claim yet today, except to point out where I think that Setia's view ends up kind of shallow. But I think this is where the interesting debates are, and it's going to get into interesting debates as well too about our reasons for creating people to love, our reasons for thinking about the population ethics going forward, our reasons of thinking about what it means to respond to reasons that we are in a certain sense in a position to also create. So these are all questions that I think quite a bit about. I think if you combine these three principles, and you'll notice none of these reference like divine revelation or events that may or may not have happened in the desert in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. These are all principles about love that we can just talk about that are inspired by the Christian tradition but are available to all of us to debate. If we get these three, then I think we get a view that starts to approximate a view of love of neighbor that is the core of Judeo-Christian ethics. And this is the moral theory that I call in the book agapeism. So I've kind of laid out the case. If you have trouble thinking of objections, I can certainly help you. One is, like, how could anybody follow this as a moral code? I mean, I have a hard enough time, like, loving the 8 people I'm responsible for in my immediate family. The idea of having to have strong, insistent reasons of love to all of you and everybody walking the streets of St. Paul tonight, and Donald Trump, and Justin Bieber, and other people who I don't like. How could this be something that's a really strong moral obligation for me? And does it in some ways, believing this about strangers, would it diminish the really important role that love plays in my family life and in my close friendships? Those are all really important objections. I think there's also a really important source of tension in this view, and the view that maybe love is so transcendent that philosophy really ought to stay out of the business of trying to analyze it. In some ways, it ruins this attitude to try to provide any kind of justification for it. So all things we could talk about. We could talk about the crisis at the southern border or anything else that's on your mind, but I'm glad that you guys are willing to come together on a Thursday night to just think and debate these topics. They're topics that have been with us, humanity, for at least 2,400 years, and I suspect quite a bit longer. I don't think that we'll resolve them in a single lecture, but I also think that this kind of philosophical reflection over time has the ability to make us better friends, to make us better citizens, and to maybe, in some cases, move us to do morally heroic things, like with Candace Payne and Teresa Todd, that if we hadn't done this work on our souls, we wouldn't have the capacity to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating crash course.
Yeah.
In
I didn't think through any of my slides. I knew I made too many.
It's fine. We still have half an hour. So.
Oh, good.
So if you have a question, just raise your hands. Andrew has a mic somewhere, I think, and so he is willing to give you the mic, and so you can ask questions. I see one over there.
Hi, my mom just sent me an article about long-termism. I think it was a critique of long-termism.
Oh, nice. Good on your mom. Is your mom a philosopher?
No.
She just hates consequentialism. Is this part going to be on YouTube? Keep going.
And I'm just wondering, when it comes to loving the stranger, obviously you've been talking about people whose lifetimes will intersect with ours, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, where do you draw a line when it comes to long-term priorities and near-term priorities, and is there like a foundational moral reason that's insistent for long-termism? Because I used to think of it more as a non-insistent reason. Like in the back of my mind, yes, we should leave the earth better than we received it.
It's a great question. What's your name? Penelope. Are you a philosophy major? Why does your mom send you such things? Oh my gosh, she's a great mom. So for those of you guys not in the know, long-termism, there's a philosopher at Oxford named William McCaskill who just wrote this book called What We Owe the Future. I mean, I think he's getting the most attention for putting this view forward right now. But, mounting this moral argument that we need to really open up our temporal lens about the people that we care about and start devoting a lot more of our moral attention to how decisions that we're making now in the year 2022 could affect the possibility of people 100 years from now to have flourishing lives or to live in safe communities. And clearly, for those of us that are following the poly-crisis, I learned that term about a month ago, that we're currently living through, climate change, failure of democratic institutions, really like rapid development of artificial intelligence that we know is going to rewrite the rules of our economy and technology, but in ways that we don't totally grasp at the moment. We've got all of this change that's piling up, and McCaskill's argument is this is exactly the time for us to figure out what kind of moral system and values we're going to embed into that system as it propagates into the future and is going to radically rewrite the terms of human life for people that are going to come after us. I think that's maybe a fair way of putting it. I haven't read the book yet. I've read a lot of the coverage of the book, and I purchased the book. Owning a philosophy book is half of getting the knowledge out of it. The other half is actually reading. As long as you guys own the Good Life method, you're already on the path to a good life. So I need to think a little bit more seriously about it. The comment I'll give tonight, I agree with McCaskill and with some of these consequentialist utilitarian philosophers on the point that there's something deeply arbitrary about caring a lot more about the present than you do about the near or distant future. In fact, that first book that I wrote that AJ referenced is called Time Biases, and the really wacky thesis of the book, I like to write books with controversial theses. The really wacky thesis of that book, and this is how I got so into the non-arbitrariness principle, is that a rational person shouldn't care when good or bad things happen in her life, whether they happened in the past or the nearby future or the distant future. You should just want good events to happen and bad events not to happen, and time should not be something that we are sensitive to. Could give a whole other talk trying to defend that. It's a kind of wacky view, but I really do believe that. You might think, morally speaking, that means imagining I have the opportunity to make a trade-off now to make sure that people in the distant future, my ancestors, children that are born in the Twin Cities, have the possibility of a minimally decent life. Morally speaking, you should make those trade-offs. That sounds intriguing to me. I think we're too sensitive and too short-sighted oftentimes when we think about what our moral obligations are. The part where I disagree, I suspect, with what McCaskill writes, and I definitely disagree with utilitarians, is thinking that the crux of morality is this kind of optimization. So for utilitarian or consequentialist philosophers, they tend to think that the core moral value that should guide our decisions and our desires is that we should want there to be as much good experience in the world as possible and minimize as much suffering as we can in the world. So we've got this variable of like good experiences or good outcomes. We should try to get that up to the maximum amount that we could as a result of our planning and our decision making. And McCaskill's hypothesis is we should stretch our time horizons for that planning quite a bit further out in the future. We should try to minimize the amount of suffering that's experienced in that same interval. And that all sounds good enough, but I think that that's a pretty myopic vision of what morality consists in. And it's pretty hard for somebody like McCaskill to explain all of the different ways that love, for instance, shapes our life. So a big part of like actual human love is extremely inefficient. Like loving someone means like wasting an entire Saturday playing board games with them and not helping the poor in the city of St. Paul. Loving someone often means becoming like deeply invested in their personal and inner life. And even if you can't do anything to alleviate their suffering, experiencing their suffering alongside of them. That's like super not utilitarian. So utilitarian would say, look, at the end of the day, we want as little suffering to happen in the world as possible. So it doesn't make a lot of rational sense for a good person to try to just go out and experience the suffering of another person if they can't minimize it. You just doubled the amount of instances of suffering in the world by experiencing a loved one's suffering. Don't do that. And I think, oh no, you should do that. Like, that's part of what loving other people really amounts to. So I think the time bit with long-termism is really intriguing and possibly even true. But I think this idea that moral life is about this certain kind of outside-facing optimization, that's false. Like, there's so much about the good and moral life that's really inefficient, that requires making trade-offs that the math is never going to work out in those ways. And one of the things that matters a lot to me in this project, and just my thinking right now, is making sure that the ways we feel this deep human pull to love others is kind of at the center of moral theory again, rather than having optimization algorithms be the center of moral theory. It's such a, this kind of consequentialist view looks around and sees us as all moral computers. And I would really like us to get back into people that are moved by compassion in sometimes inefficient ways. That's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm glad your mom is making you think about it.
Hi there. I realized about halfway through your introduction that I had actually listened to you on the Good Faith podcast about a month ago. So congratulations on making Christian philosophy micro-celebrity status.
That was the most important podcast I've ever done.
Nice.
I know. I feel like that's as big as it's ever going to get. But thank you. I'm glad you got a listener.
Yeah, big fan. But my question, and you might have been partially answering it there. I'm not a philosophy major by any stretch, but I actually came here tonight specifically because I had an incident happen to me earlier today that I've been kind of searching for answers on, and it's been something that's been kind of on my mind for a while. But I had to get on the light rail pretty early this morning, and I'm tired, and I'm a little bit congested and kind of headache, and like a fist fight breaks out. Like, it's not even 5 a.m. and like people brawling on the light rail. Yeah. And so we'll work from the assumption that I've already bought into I know who my neighbor is, I know how to love them, but I guess my like follow-up question to the philosophy major asking Jesus the question of, well, who's my neighbor, is how do I love my neighbor? What sort of moral framework do I go about using to love my neighbor? Because I had some options in that situation where I had a pepper spray thing in my pocket that I didn't know if I should whip out and use. I didn't know if I should get in there and try and break it up. But in true Midwest fashion, I did nothing but I called the police. And so I've been kind of working through that. I'm new to the Twin Cities. This is a very different culture. And so in some respect, these aren't my people. This isn't my homeland. I'm a sojourner, but I mean, hey, aren't we all? So what sort of a framework do I go about amalgamating for that? I hope that is an appropriate question for this. And I don't know if this is like hey kid, no, I do the how, not the why.
I just tell you the philosophical truths. It's up to you to follow them.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, no, what's your name? David, we're glad you're here. This is like, it's a whole chapter of the book, and this is like the hardest problem for this view. Like, if you think this is true, why aren't you following it? I mean, this is kind of, it goes with, at least the utilitarian philosophers, they like come up with a view, this is my moral obligation with respect to climate change, and then they start donating a lot of money to that cause. They like act on that view. You might think this view about we have an obligation to love strangers. If you saw two of your brothers getting in a fist, I don't know if you have brothers. If I saw my brothers in a fist fight on light rail, I would step in and like break it up, sit down, let's figure out what's going on. But oftentimes we find ourselves observing strangers who are in need, and we are utterly unmoved. There's a tradition in the Ignatian spiritual tradition in Catholicism of reading these parables and just imagining yourself as every single character in the parable, and you're not allowed to quickly dismiss one of the characters like, that's not me. Instead, you got to walk through and be like, this is what I'm doing when I'm in like Levite mode in this story. This is what I'm doing when I'm the innkeeper. This is what I would be like if I were the donkey. They make you do the donkey. You might think, look, most of the time, if we're being honest, we're in priest and Levite mode. Like, we're just like, oh man, and something weird happened on the Jericho Road again today on the light rail on the way to the U, and like I just can't deal with this morning. And I don't know, the first step is probably saying that that's true. I share this with my students when I teach the parable of the Good Samaritan in my God and the Good Life course. I tell the students I go to the gym almost every morning, and this CrossFit gym that I go to, yeah, I do CrossFit badly, is right next to one of the big homeless shelters in town. And, you know, more often than not, most mornings of the week, there'll be at least one guest of the homeless shelter who's outside the shelter in the cold South Bend weather, who's definitely ailing from some kind of drug reaction or overdose, who's not allowed in the shelter, and is having the worst morning ever. And I drive by, and I see that person, and I've stopped 0% of the time to try to address that situation. And I'm smart. I can come up with all kinds of rationalizations, like, oh, it's dangerous. I don't know how to help people who are dealing with serious drug addiction. Like, I can give one thought too many. I'm good. Philosophers are really good at generating too many thoughts for why I don't stop. But that's not, in fact, like why I don't stop. I just don't stop because I'm unmoved by those situations, or at least not moved enough to think about diverting my gym schedule. I also know that if that were my brother that was overdosing on drugs for the third or fourth time, I would stop 100% of the time and be like, what's going on? We got to get you to a hospital. Like, how did you find yourself in this situation? We got to stop this from continuing to happen. I mean, over time, dealing with somebody who's got intense suffering, you might grow defense mechanisms and like grow your kind of compassion scabs, but at least initially you would be moved. And we have to deal with this. I tell my students, like, I drive by and then I come 2 hours later into class and I teach you about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I tell you I think that this view about reasons of love is true, but I never stop. So, like, what does that mean? Do I either not believe this moral theory that I've spent so much time trying to argue for? Does it mean that I just have to admit that I'm not a moral person? So there's something about knowing something as a philosopher but being utterly unmoved to act on it? Or is it something else? Where I've kind of fallen on this, I think this is a really hard question for just doing moral philosophy, and frankly, if you have moral beliefs that are really demanding, but you're also not following them, like just a problem for living your life. Here's where I've come down. I don't think that the philosophy is useless just because thinking about this problem so much has not caused me to stop and help. Like, it didn't have that moral therapy for me. It didn't give me immediate enlightenment about what to do if I'm on the light rail and I see a fight. Philosophy is not a quick fix. There are other kinds of interventions, maybe certain kinds of like therapy, certain kinds of techniques in psychology where you can change your behaviors quickly. But philosophy, however it works on us, it works in a slow way. What I think thinking about these moral theories does is, if you spend a lot of time thinking about the parable and you spend some time going to talks like this rather than watching Netflix, and you also spend time noticing the moral significance of things that are happening in your day that you might have just like not even noticed or thought about. You might not have given a second thought to the fight on the light rail. Now you're thinking about it. Over time, kind of connecting these events that are happening in your life with connecting these big ideas that you think, maybe that's my belief system, maybe that is my code. Over time, that slow burning reaction hopefully happens within us, and maybe like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I might not stop and like rescue homeless men who are overdosing next to my gym, but I might behave differently towards them because I'll have that kind of more sophisticated understanding about what it means to care for them. And I think philosophy has that power, and that might be like good enough to justify writing books about this or thinking about it so obsessively. But I also don't know of any better way for us to try to like figure out how to handle these moral problems that once we become aware of them, we realize are happening like every day in our lives. But I also take your point. It's something I think about all the time, of like this difference between what you think you're really called to do and what you're actually doing. I've also moved just thinking about the kinds of ethical questions that come out of the Gospels. There's a great passage, I guess, in Matthew, where a guy goes to Jesus and asks the same question, like, what do I have to do to get to the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, well, sell all your possessions and follow me. And the gospel tells us that the young man went away because he had many possessions. He's like, not today. I think that's we're meant to like harshly judge that young man, but I think all of us in our moral lives, it's kind of like where we're at. We're thinking about these questions, we're reasoning through them, and we're really lucky if we can sell like one of our possessions in any given particular year, divest ourselves of some of our bad habits, and the process of trying to get there is slow and gradual. But it's a great question. One more question. I'm way too long on. I was warned about this yesterday too.
Thanks for such a thought-provoking talk. Like your 100 slides led to 100 questions.
I have so many more slides. Like it's got John Cottingham.
Yeah.
We were gonna get Candace Payne again.
I will only ask one of my 100 questions. So I was thinking about how this Samaritanism can sometimes lead and come in conflict with like what it means to actually do good. Like loving others can conflict with doing good. And I was thinking about when I was 16 and just got my driver's license, I was like, loved the parable of the Good Samaritan and thought about how can I love my neighbors with my driver's license. And I was driving in my small town and saw this guy on the corner of the street and he said, hey, can you help me get to this motel? And I was like, yes, sure, absolutely, here we go. And then I take him to a hotel and find out that I've aided and abetted in a drug deal and, potentially could have lost my phone and caused my family significant hardship in trying to replace my phone. So, when loving others conflicts with doing good, how do we think through that?
I think this is a great question. This is a slide that I skipped. But one, I'm not going to give you a quick answer to this. I think there's a really interesting question for moral life about what happens. Like, do we find ourselves in situations as people who care about morality where sometimes we have really important moral obligations that directly conflict with each other? Another way philosophers ask this question is moral tragedy possible? And if so, how prevalent is it? Where you have it's something totally morally important to be willing to be moved by the plight of strangers and to trust them. And it's also incredibly important to not support the drug trade in your community. And either because of human frailty, the fact that we never have complete information about our scenarios, or maybe it's just sometimes like the world is conspired where our obligations are directly pointed against each other. Like, does this happen in our lives? A question I think about a lot, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I do think that there is a tendency, especially for people who've not thought about the parable of the Good Samaritan philosophically, to think that this is just like one of those super easy VeggieTale style moral theories in Christianity. Like, that Samaritan, he was a good guy, he stopped to help. Not realizing that Samaritanism, if it's understood in the way that we've been trying to build it out tonight, could be really countercultural in ways that honestly can get Samaritans in big trouble and anger a lot of people. And one example, Teresa Todd is maybe one example of this. A more interesting, even more controversial example, also happening at the southern border, involves Sister Norma Pimentel. If you followed her, she's a Catholic nun who works on the southern border, helping people who've just recently crossed over illegally or legally, she doesn't ask, to get the kind of basic necessities of human dignity, to get adequate housing and food, if they need legal representation, to find somebody to represent them, to get access to education or education for their children. And again, that all maybe sounds like relatively uncontroversial depending on what your political views are about immigration. But Sister Norma really got a lot of heat during COVID for pulling a peak Samaritan move. People were crossing over the southern border in just the same waves during COVID as before. The hotel and motel industry at the southern border, the bottom fell out of it. Nobody was staying at hotels and motels anymore, especially during that first wave of COVID when there was no vaccines. So rates for hotels and motels were really low, and a lot of those hotels and motels were worried about going out of business. Well, in comes Sister Norma. You got a bunch of unhoused people who've recently crossed over the border, many of whom are COVID positive and need to socially isolate. You got a bunch of hotel and motel rooms at rock bottom rates. This seems like an excellent opportunity to redistribute some of these tithes to those hotel and motel owners, and she just rented out a block of rooms, took these unhoused people who'd come over, many of whom were COVID positive, put them in hotel rooms, socially isolated them, did a Candace Payne, like brought them food and basic necessities, and kind of put them up in the hotel. And at first, the hotels and motels were like, this is great. We have rooms that are filled again. We were like this close to going out of business. And then they realized that these were COVID positive immigrants that were staying in the hotel rooms and were very not okay with this decision to aid them in this way. And it made national news, and the charity that she runs was accused of flaunting the laws and putting a bunch of people in danger by interacting with COVID positive migrants in this way. And it was a huge kerfuffle. And she ended up apologizing even for this decision. And you find yourself in this scenario realizing that, like, your act, there's an innkeeper in the Gospel of Luke. You know, it's not just that the Samaritan directly provides aid to that injured man on the side of the road. There's a whole social network that's involved with the transaction of aiding that person. And this is where Sister Norma got into trouble, is her act of expressing her Christian love towards those migrants who'd crossed over the border with COVID then implicated the entire economy of Brownsville, Texas. And a lot of people who didn't agree with her Samaritan ethic and definitely didn't agree with her view about immigration at the southern border. So what do you do when your act of Samaritanism is interacting with a world that's got a lot of suffering and a lot of challenges in it, and also with other people, supporting characters in your parable who don't necessarily agree with your extremely demanding moral code? And this is going to be, I think, one of the really difficult issues that you have to wrestle with in these cases. And this is why I think it's incredibly important for us to try to identify the principles and the reasons behind those principles that are motivating Samaritans to do these things, because we have to know if their arguments are any good if we're going to try to defend them from this kind of criticism. If the moral arguments aren't that good, then maybe Sister Norma shouldn't have done this. Maybe Teresa Todd should have just called 911 and shouldn't have stopped to help. And it would change our evaluation of what people do in these cases. So I also think that it's a really good question and one that I've been thinking a lot about.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sullivan, for
Thank you guys.
for speaking tonight and for entertaining so many questions. I can imagine almost all of us probably have a question for you, and we could have gone for hours and hours and hours. We don't have time for that. No. But there will be a reception afterwards. Dan is going to talk about that, and so you can join us, and there will be some time for more questions. Before Dan is going to talk, I have two books here, signed by Dr. Sullivan, and we got a couple of people who submitted their names. Here are the two lucky people, Glenn Brett and David Hendrickson. So you guys can pick up those books here.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Sullivan and AJ and everyone, for what an engaging lecture. What a feast of ideas. My name is Dan Olson, and I serve here as managing director. And I actually first got connected to Anselm House at the 6th Annual Holmer Lecture. So it was 16 years ago. I was sitting in a room like this. And maybe that's you tonight. Whether this is your first ever Anselm House event, or your 27th, or for Glenn Bratt, your 2000th, we invite you to stick around and join us at our study center for a reception. There's a map up here. You can see we are sitting in the room right there, and you're going to go out that direction and then turn right and head over to Cleveland and then take a left. You're going to notice that you may not walk past strangers who are in need of help, but you are going to notice a road that's in significant need of repair, and it's being worked on. Don't stop and repair it. Come right up to our house, which you'll see down about a block and a half down there. So we'd love to have you join for refreshments, fellowship with Dr. Sullivan. She'll be joining us with board and staff who are here. And I will also, when we're over there, briefly share a few non-insistent reasons for ways that you can help with our major move to the east bank of campus, right at the corner of Oak and Washington. So in the next, 30 days, we're going to need a lot of help. And the new presence at the corner of Oak and Washington is named Melrose Station in honor of the late Ken Melrose, along with many others who joined him in making gifts due to a significant belief in long-termism as it relates to our mission here at the U. So we'd love to have you join us. And we also have one gift to give to Dr. Sullivan. which you all can get on October 26th if you join us for a big soiree that we're doing. But this is a book that we've published in honor of our 40-year anniversary, and we're not giving it out to people until October 26th, except because you won't be able to be here unless you do fly back. We're going to give you a copy. So join me again in giving a round of applause for Dr. Sullivan. And please do join us.